Harriet Wilcox shifted uneasily on the floral couch in her small office. Despite being Bayleaf Bay's only property manager, she never expected to be left in the dark about her own rentals. The puzzle had started 2 months ago with a new tenant, a quiet graduate student who'd responded to her "for rent" sign almost immediately. He paid cash for the first month, promised to come by with references, and vanished 3 days later without a single word. The only trace left behind was a half-burned photograph on the kitchen table. That in itself was odd, but it continued to repeat almost like clockwork with each new occupant who passed through the door of Cottage 4. At first, Harriet thought it was some sort of elaborate prank. Maybe a bored local teen was trying to frighten people away from rentals. Or perhaps an ex-tenant had returned to plague her with bizarre stunts. But the photo scraps were each faintly different. Sometimes it was a picture of a sailing boat beside a woman in an old-fashioned dress. Other times a picnic scene. Always, however, the old images were half-burned, edges curled by flame, the faces partially obscured by soot. No phone calls, no notes, just a photograph she couldn't decipher. "Harriet," said her friend and occasional volunteer maintenance man Cliff Daly, "you look like a spooked cat." He stood in the doorway of her office wearing his usual cargo shorts, wide-brimmed straw hat and a worried frown. "Another tenant gone?" She nodded. "Same as before, and again I found a piece of a photograph, half singed. This one looked like a young girl holding a cat in front of the cottage, but the faces were blackened." Cliff's brow wrinkled. Could be a clue. Or just an old family memory. Might be an attempt at intimidation. "You intimidate a stranger walking into a new lease?" Harriet asked, pressing her fingertips together. "Unless there's something about that cottage itself. Something that no one told me?" She thought about the old wooden structure, which had sat near the shoreline for over 100 years. Harriet had grown up in Bayleaf Bay, but her recollection of the cottage's history was patchy. "Well, I can poke around, see if there's anything physically wrong with it," Cliff offered. "Could be mold, faulty wiring, or something else that's scaring them off." "Thanks. I'll come with you. Between your handyman know-how and my curiosity, we might figure out what in the world is going on." They drove down the short stretch of main road from Harriet's office to the row of seaside cottages. The crashing surf provided a steady rhythm of noise just 1 block away. Tall sea grasses swayed in the wind, occasionally brushing the wooden porches. Cottage 4 stood at the center of the row, a nondescript house with a wraparound porch and white paint that had begun to peel from salt air. Inside, Harriet could still smell a hint of the previous occupant's cologne, a reminder that a real person had lived there mere days ago. Harriet marched into the compact living room, paused by the kitchen table, and pointed at a scorch mark left on the faded tablecloth. She had already collected the half-burned photo. "This is where it was," she said. Cliff leaned in, sniffed. "Smells like old ashes. Did you bag up the photo piece?" She nodded and unzipped her purse, pulling out a small plastic envelope. Inside lay a curled rectangle of old-fashioned photographic paper. The top half displayed a blurry figure holding a cat and an outline of the cottage behind them. The bottom edge was charred. "Same as the others," Harriet said. "Different subjects, but the same style, same burn pattern." Cliff rubbed his chin. 1940s or 1950s maybe. Could be older. Might want to talk to Wilma at the Historical Society. She's a walking encyclopedia on all things Bayleaf Bay. Not wanting to waste time, Harriet agreed they should stop by Wilma's office as soon as possible. After a quick glance through the cottage's rooms, which revealed no immediate leads, they made their way to the Historical Society across town. Wilma Jones, a petite woman with silvery hair coiled into a bun, greeted them from behind a giant ledger. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Wilma asked, eyes gleaming. Harriet slid the plastic envelope safe onto the table. "We found this in Cottage 4, my rental property. Actually, I found 4 others nearly identical, with different scenes but always half-burned. Do you happen to recognize who might be in the photo? Wilma carefully inspected the charred scrap, adjusting her reading glasses. It's an older style, that's for sure. The printing technique looks mid-century. Hard to tell exactly who that is, but it might be a child. Yes, and the background is definitely the same cottage. Bayleaf Bay used to be a booming canning town back then. Let's see if we can look it up in the property records or archived newspapers. They followed Wilma through corridors of file cabinets and shelves of cracked spine. She methodically slid open a drawer labeled Property Deeds 1930 to 1959. Within minutes, she retrieved a stack of aging documents for Harriet's cottages. Harriet noticed her name scrawled alongside her grandparents' names, who'd once owned the entire row. But there were older deeds, too, and Wilma laid them carefully on a tabletop to examine. Scanning the older deeds, Harriet identified a series of owners for Cottage 4, stretching back to a woman named Lavinia Shawes. Next to that was a notation about an inheritance dispute. Another sheet mentioned fire damage in 1952. Fire damage, Harriet murmured. This might explain the half-burned photos. It looks like there was a partial fire in the property, Wilma said, running her finger down the page. Apparently Miss Shawes was involved in a complicated story. There was talk that she lost a child, or maybe the child died in the fire. Harriet raised an eyebrow. So there was a tragedy. Cliff quietly listened. Would a tragedy explain our disappearing tenants? If the place is rumored to be haunted, or if there's a rumor that freaks people out, it might cause them to leave. Wilma nodded thoughtfully. Possibly, but you'd think they'd at least say something, not just vanish. Unless someone doesn't want them to mention it, or they're compelled by fear. She set the folder down. We can check newspapers from the 1950s. If there was a tragedy, the local paper, Bayleaf Times, would have covered it. They spent a solid hour perusing yellowed newspaper clippings, scanning articles for mention of Cottage 4 and the name Lavinia Shawes. Finally, Harriet poked a finger at a headline from June 10, 1952. Mystery baby vanishes in cottage fire. Mother claims child was taken. The article described how a small fire broke out in the early morning, damaging the kitchen. Miss Shawes, frantic, insisted she'd awakened to see flames. When the neighbors arrived to investigate, Miss Shawes was alone. She claimed her baby daughter was gone, kidnapped rather than burned, though no suspect ever materialized. Town gossip concluded the child likely died in the fire, but no remains were discovered. The local police eventually dropped the case. Harriet rubbed her arms, feeling a shiver that had nothing to do with the chilled air. Maybe these photographs are some kind of artifact of that tragedy. But how do they keep showing up? You said each tenant discovered them, Harriet, Wilma asked. Not exactly. The tenants vanish, but they leave a half-burned photo behind, Harriet clarified. Each photo is different. One was a picnic scene, another was a boat, and this one had a child with a cat. Could they somehow be recreations of family memories? Maybe images from a lost photo album, Cliff mused quietly. Could be. Ghostly phenomenon. Or someone with a personal stake in the property might be planting them. Or it might be something about the house that prompts people to dig up an old box in the attic. Wilma lowered her voice. I've heard rumors, for many years, about strange happenings in that cottage. Lights flickering, the sounds of a baby crying. Could that tie in somehow? Harriet glanced at the stack of ancient newspaper pages again. Ghost stories usually stay ghost stories, but if there's even a grain of truth, maybe people are hearing or seeing something that rattles them to the point they just flee. She frowned. I wish they'd at least talk to me first. After leaving the Historical Society, Harriet and Cliff divided their tasks. Cliff agreed to do a deeper inspection, possibly searching the attic or crawl space for hidden boxes of photos. Harriet would contact the last known tenant to see if she could glean any clues. She doubted the attempt would succeed. None of them had responded to her calls or emails. but she had to try. The next morning, Harriet stepped onto Cottage 4's porch with renewed purpose. She carried an extra flashlight and a determination not to be frightened by possible eerie phenomena. Cliff greeted her at the door, brandishing a small crowbar. "I found an old hatch leading beneath the floorboards in the back carriage room. Seems no one's opened it for years. I figure we can explore it." Inside, Harriet flipped on her flashlight. Musty air greeted them. "Let's do it. Maybe we'll find that secret box of old family photos, or some clue that ties these images together." The hatch opened to a small crawl space. Cliff lowered himself first, calling to Harriet to be careful of the jutting nails. She handed him her flashlight, then followed a moment later. The only thing in the darkness was the pungent odor of damp earth. Harriet wrinkled her nose. "Not a place you'd want to hang around in," she muttered. Cliff aimed his light around in one corner. Water dripped from a leaky pipe. In another, Harriet thought she spotted a cluster of old crates. They made their way forward until Harriet felt her foot bump the corner of a wooden box. "Got something here," she whispered. She crouched, wiped away spiderwebs, and saw a stack of old black and white photos. Each had a scorched edge. A tattered cloth bag lay next to them. Cliff peered over her shoulder. "Whoa, this is definitely something." Harriet gathered them carefully, shining the beam across each image. She saw a woman in a polka dot dress standing by a fence, another photograph of a toddler near the water, and yet another shot of the cottage itself. All had partially charred edges, as though someone had tried to burn them. This must be an old family album that ended up here. But how did they get from the crawl space up to the table? She flicked a glance at Cliff. "Someone's bringing them up," he said with an uneasy expression. "Or something." Harriet placed the photos in a large Ziploc bag. "We need to show these to Wilma, or someone who might identify the people." Her mind whirled with questions. Could these images be from the same set that Miss Shaw's owned decades ago? Did the baby in the fire survive, or was the child truly kidnapped? And how were new tenants connected? They returned above ground, snapping the hatch shut behind them. Harriet sat on the porch steps to catch her breath. Something about the discovery shimmered with significance, yet she still had no explanation for the missing tenants. Cliff broke the silence. "We should ask around, maybe talk to neighbors who've lived here a long time. I recall old Mr. Timmons next door has been in Bayleaf Bay for ages. He might remember hearing stories from the 50s. It took some coaxing for the elderly neighbor to open his door, but eventually Harriet and Cliff found themselves in Mr. Timmons's musty sitting room, perched on a sunken sofa. The old man's watery eyes and shaky hands conveyed both age and curiosity. "No one's lived in that cottage for very long, not since I can remember," Mr. Timmons said. "Something about that place just sets folks on edge." Harriet showed him one of the newly discovered photos. "Do you recognize the woman or the child?" Mr. Timmons squinted at it for a long moment, lips pursed. "That woman looks like Miss Shaw's. Used to see her out in the yard. She was always fussing about something, looking over her shoulder, as if she expected someone to come take her baby away." He tapped the picture with a crooked finger. "Rumor was she had some sort of romantic entanglement that ended badly. Couldn't marry the father, maybe. Then there was that fire, and no one ever saw the child again." "Did she stay in Bayleaf Bay?" Harriet asked. "For a while, yes." Mr. Timmons set the photo on the side table with care, but she got more and more unstable. Spoke of ghostly visitors at night. Eventually she left. Some say she went north, others say she was locked up in an asylum. The gossip was cruel, but none of us knew the full truth. When Harriet pressed for more detail, he admitted he didn't know exactly what had happened to her. He'd heard the rumors like everyone else. Harriet thanked him and left with Cliff, still dissatisfied. She was missing something crucial. The reason half-burned photos kept appearing on the table whenever a tenant left. The next day, Harriet posted a sign advertising Cottage 4 for rent again. But this time, she did it expecting to watch the new tenant more closely. She didn't normally operate this way, but she was determined to be on the lookout for suspicious activity or nighttime intruders. If the pattern held, the new tenant would arrive, only to run off within days. Harriet was resolved to stay on guard. Within hours of placing the sign up, Harriet received a call from a woman named Pamela Rogers who was eager to move in. She needed a place close to her new job at the Bayleaf Diner. Harriet arranged to meet her at the cottage that very evening. She meticulously prepared, arriving early with 2 travel mugs of tea, determined to exude warmth and normalcy. Pamela was a short, chatty woman with a bright smile. She happily toured the small living room, nodded approvingly at the cozy kitchen, and babbled on about how she was excited to walk by the shore each morning. Harriet couldn't help noticing a curious tension in the woman's eyes, as though Pamela was anticipating something, though Harriet couldn't be sure if it was just moving stress. They signed the lease, and Harriet gave Pamela the key. On the surface, nothing seemed amiss. Harriet retreated to her car, deciding to park half a block away and keep a discreet watch overnight. If the culprit behind the missing tenants showed up at midnight to plant a half-burned photo, Harriet intended to know why. Around 9 that evening, Harriet was dozing in the driver's seat, the sound of waves crashing repetitively in her ears. Only the occasional gust of wind rattled her windows. Suddenly, she jerked awake to see a flicker of light in Pamela's window. Leaning forward, Harriet spotted a faint glow like a candle or small flashlight. Unable to suppress her curiosity, Harriet tiptoed across the grass and peered in through the living room window. Inside, Pamela seemed to be kneeling by the coffee table, speaking softly to someone Harriet couldn't see. Could there be a second person inside? But Harriet had distinctly seen only one figure. She slid along the side of the house and pressed her ear near the window. There was a low hum of conversation, then a distinct sob. She tried to see better, but could only pick up Pamela's voice, halting and muffled. She caught fragments of words. You, child, lost, can't rest, need father. Harriet's heart pounded. Was Pamela communing with a spirit? The notion felt wild, but the shadows dancing across the wall hinted at a candle or open flame. Carefully, Harriet tiptoed around to the front door and tried the knob. It was locked. As she debated whether to knock, a sudden voice behind her made her jump. "Harriet?" whispered Cliff, who had also shown up, worried about her late-night stakeout. She let out a breath of relief. "You scared me half to death." Quickly she explained what she'd witnessed. Together they crouched below the window, listening intently. A moment later the voices stopped. Harriet heard rummaging noises, a small pop of something hitting the table. Then the living room light turned on, and Pamela started pacing. Cliff leaned in. "We should check on her. Maybe she's in trouble." Gathering her courage, Harriet rapped softly. "Pamela? It's Harriet. Sorry to bother you, but I forgot to leave you some instructions about the garbage schedule." She winced at her own clumsy excuse, but a moment later the door cracked open. Pamela's eyes shone with unshed tears. "Harriet," she whispered, glancing behind her, as if worried someone else might be listening. I'm not sure this place is right for me." Harriet fixed her with a sympathetic look. "May I come in?" Pamela hesitated, then nodded. In the living room, Harriet noticed a small candle on the coffee table and, sure enough, a half-burned photograph. Sooty edges curled upward, a corner still aflame. Cliff stepped forward to pinch the flame out with his fingers. "What's going on?" Harriet asked, voice gentle. Pamela sank onto the couch, shoulders trembling. "I don't know why, but as soon as I came inside I felt presence. A baby crying, a woman calling for help, a sense of tragedy. Then, as I was about to go to bed, these images just appeared in my mind. I felt compelled to burn them. But when I lit the candle, I saw an actual photograph on the table, like it manifested out of thin air." Cliff exchanged a look with Harriet. "Have you experienced anything like this before?" Pamela shook her head. "Never. I know this sounds crazy, but I felt the woman's desperation. All I could think about was that she wanted me to help her child find rest, or help her figure out what really happened. That's when I started chanting some words out loud, hoping to calm the spirit. Harriet perched on the chair across from her, leaning forward. Pamela, do you think you can describe what you saw or felt? Anything about who might be behind these photos? Pamela drew a shaky breath. I saw a name in my mind. Lavinia. She lost her baby in a fire, but she never believed the baby died. She believed the father took her. And now, it's like her spirit can't move on unless she knows the truth. The photographs must be her memories, trying to break through. Harriet felt chills prickle her arms. Lavinia Shores, she murmured. Pamela, if this is true, then you might be the key to releasing Lavinia's spirit. All these years the cottage carried her imprint. She hesitated, knowing how strange it all sounded. Yet she had no better explanation for the vanished tenants or the half-burned photos. Pamela clenched her hands tightly. I'm frightened, but I also feel empathy for that poor woman. Maybe I can stay, but it'll take courage. Cliff ventured a question. What if we try some kind of session here, letting Lavinia speak through a medium? See if we can find a resolution. Harriet turned to him. Are you suggesting a séance? She half expected to laugh, but the situation defied conventional logic. If it helps, I'll try anything to stop losing tenants. Let's do it properly, though. We should talk to someone who's done this before. Within hours, Harriet contacted an eccentric but well-respected local spiritual guide named Daisy Gillespie, who'd led healing circles and had a reputation for soothing restless spirits, at least according to the stories. The next evening, the four of them gathered in the living room: Harriet, Cliff, Pamela, and Daisy, an older woman with warm brown eyes and a steady voice. They sat around the coffee table, lights dimmed. Daisy placed a single white candle in the center and lit it. Lavinia Shores, Daisy said softly, we invite you to speak. We want to help you find what you've lost. The candle flame flickered, casting dancing shadows. At first, nothing happened. Then Harriet felt a cold draft settle over the room. Pamela inhaled sharply and shut her eyes, as though focusing intently on something unseen. For a long moment, the only sound was the hush of the ocean breeze outside. Then Pamela gasped. It's so strong, she whispered. She's showing me the fire, how it started in the kitchen. She says she woke to smoke. She rushed to the cradle but found it empty. She's calling out for the father's name as Martin Cole. He threatened to take their baby away if she didn't leave Bayleaf Bay. Daisy's eyes widened briefly but remained calm. Ask her what happened to Martin Cole. Where did he go? Pamela squeezed her eyes shut. Then her voice changed, becoming slightly lower, trembling in a way that didn't sound completely hers. He left town by boat that night, heading east. He took the baby with him. Lavinia tried to follow, but by the time she ran outside, the boat was gone. She told everyone the child was taken, but no one believed her. They thought the baby perished in the flames. Harriet felt the hair on her neck stand on end. The baby wasn't a ghost at all. She was simply abducted. Lavinia's spirit's been restless, trying to get the truth acknowledged. Pamela gave a small nod. Yes, she wants closure, proof that her child lived, or at least for someone to believe her. Thinking quickly, Harriet recalled the property records and local archives. We can try searching the maritime logs or genealogies for Martin Cole. If we can prove he took that baby, we might be able to release Lavinia's spirit. Daisy's gentle voice carried reassurance. That's precisely the kind of resolution restless spirits need. Over the next week, Harriet and Cliff, with help from Wilma at the Historical Society, dug through dusty shipping records and county birth registries. They discovered a Martin Cole had indeed departed Bayleaf Bay on a fishing vessel in 1952, heading to a coastal town further north. The Historical Society there possessed partial records indicating Martin Cole arrived with an infant daughter named Prudence. The trail eventually led to a woman in her 70s living just 2 towns away, who might be that same Prudence Cole. With a burst of excitement, Harriet arranged to phone the potential daughter. The voice at the other end was understandably shocked to hear Harriet's story. Local genealogical curiosity, Harriet explained. But after a few cautious questions, the woman revealed that she'd been raised by her single father, Martin, who'd told her that her mother died in a fire. Harriet's breath caught. Here lay the missing piece. Days later, Prudence made a journey to Bayleaf Bay. The moment she stepped into Cottage 4, Harriet felt a shift in the air, as if the stifling heaviness had lifted. Prudence, trembling, stood in the living room, tears gathering in her eyes. "Father always told me my mother perished in the fire. He never said anything about kidnapping me. He was a stern man, never spoke of the past." Pamela, perched quietly on the sofa, felt that same energy surge through her. "I can sense her," she whispered. "She's here, watching." With infinite gentleness, Prudence set a small framed photo on the table, one she had of her father and herself as a baby. "I just want my mother to know I lived a full life. I wish we'd had a chance to meet." A slight breeze ruffled through the open window, though the night was still. Harriet felt a tingling warmth fill the room, and for the first time in weeks, no half-burnt photograph materialized. The weight that had hung over Cottage 4 seemed to dissipate. In the days that followed, Pamela decided to remain in the cottage, relieved that the eerie presence had quieted. She reported no strange activity, and Harriet's phone stopped ringing with frantic calls. The old heartbreak bound to the cottage had finally found some measure of peace in the reunion of mothers' and daughters' stories, despite the decades that separated them. When Harriet next walked down the row of cottages, an early morning sun was glimmering across the bay's surface, scattering gold along the wet sand. She passed Cottage 4 and marveled at how ordinary it now looked. Just a cozy place with peeling paint and the promise of fresh beginnings. Inside, she imagined Pamela tidying the kitchen, humming a tune. Upstairs, the wind might blow softly through the open windows, no longer carrying the anguish of an unsolved mystery. She paused, reading over her notes about the last few months. So much had changed. The puzzle of burnt photographs, the vanished tenants who'd fled unwittingly from a presence that only wanted to be heard, and the rediscovery of a complicated family history. Harriet realized that, contrary to any cynicism she'd once harbored, the spirits of the past were not always monstrous. Sometimes they were simply lonely, longing to be acknowledged and understood. Turning away from Cottage 4, Harriet caught sight of Cliff, who came ambling up the road with a toolbox in one hand. "Just checking in on a leaky faucet," he called. He grinned, and Harriet returned the smile. They both knew the house would stand strong for future tenants, free from the haunt of unsolved tragedy. For Harriet, that was enough to finally rest easy, confident that Bayleaf Bay's strangest mystery had found its resolution at last.